And welcome, everybody. Again, I feel privileged to be here with all of you. And I understand that some of you are teachers, some of you are parents. Some of you probably have vast knowledge around the science of reading. Some of you, this might be the beginning of your journey. So wherever you are and whatever role you come to this with, I really sincerely hope that this is going to be a time well spent for us to ponder some big ideas around this topic, this really important topic. So thanks again for that nice introduction, Beth. And again, I'm just so happy to be here. So yes, I come to you from outside of Chicago, the Windy City, and it's a beautiful fall evening here tonight. I hope it's lovely where you are as well. Um, as you know, as Beth mentioned, I've been in education for a really long time, and I've worn lots of hats. But really, the through line of all of my work has been my commitment to and my passion for early literacy. I kind of have a mission statement on my wall here in my office, and I know all of you probably each have your own kind of personal mission or purpose statement. I just want to share that with you tonight. I want to play whatever role I can to ensure that all children learn to read joyfully in the primary grades, enabling them to flourish as literate citizens of the 21st century. And I chose those words really carefully. I chose the word all, joyfully, flourish. I know that like me, you want all of our children to reap the benefits of a literate life, because the gifts of a literate life are many, and learning to read is the gateway to those gifts. So I want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. Again, I know you're educators, you're parents, some of you are both, and you're really doing the most important work we can do. It's a challenge to reach all of our students, and we're all in this together. We're all here to support one another. And that's really why I'm here tonight, is to offer some thoughts and explorations that allow us to keep moving forward so that we can deliver on this promise for all of our students. Okay, so let's dig in. Now, the topic du jour is the science of reading. So I think we really need to start with that, what it is and why it matters. So I am going to use the definition from my handy dandy little defining guide from the Reading League. Some of you might know this document, this little booklet, and I want you to go ahead and read this definition for yourself. Okay, that's our working definition, right? The science of reading isn't something we do. It's a body of research that informs the choices we make as educators. Here's a little bit more. Go ahead and read this to yourself. Now, this is the part where sometimes when I show this, people go, whoa, I didn't know that. I thought science of reading was new. It's 5 decades, thousands of studies, multiple languages. This can be very surprising sometimes. And I'll let you read this final paragraph to yourself as well. So we know a lot. We know a lot about how we learn to read and how instruction can maximize that development. So that's what the science of reading is. It's important to take a look at what the science of reading is not. It is not a philosophy or a political agenda. It's definitely not a specific component of instruction. I've heard people say that, well, the science of reading is all about phonics. It's not. It's not any of these things. Again, it's this body of ever changing and evolving research that really drives our instructional choices. And I really want to make sure that we're all in this whole idea of about science. Science is dynamic. The science of reading is not an exact blueprint for what we do all the time, because science is not static. Science is dynamic. We're always striving to know the research and follow where it leads us. And it's really important to remember, we don't have research on everything. Where we do have a preponderance of research, we follow it. And this is what Steve Dykstra, some of you might know Dr. Steve Dykstra. I encourage you to check out on social media, YouTube. He refers to this as bullseye science. For example, we know students who receive instruction in the alphabetic code or phonics fare better than those who do not. However, the science doesn't tell us exactly what order to teach the phonetic elements or exactly how long to teach phonics every day. So for that, we don't have randomized controlled studies, but we do have guidelines based on classroom studies that show that some practices are more impactful than others. So we continue to follow the research, know those high impact practices, and we continue to learn and adapt and grow, right? That's what the science of reading is all about. Now, with all that being said about not being static, we actually do know a lot. And you would think with this abundant research that we would have very high literacy rates in this country. And sadly, we do not. I want you to go ahead and read this next slide. So some of us in our teacher preparation program weren't availed of this information. And maybe that resonates with you. It certainly does with me. I've had to rethink a lot of my initial concepts around reading and reading instruction. But this, to me, is a very exciting time to be an educator. So when we look at what we know now versus what we know then, it's important to remember, it's no shame, no blame zone. We take this new knowledge that maybe wasn't availed to us in our preparation and we move forward with urgency and conviction, right? So there's a direct correlation between what we know and how our students do. That's why we continue to learn and grow. So the big ideas that we're going to explore tonight, we're going to explore reading acquisition. How do we learn to read? We're going to explore some of the neuroscience. What are some key things we know about the reading brain? We're going to look at a couple of frameworks, which I'm guessing many of you are familiar with. Simple View of Reading and Scarborough's Rope. And then I'm going to leave you with some takeaways. I'm going to leave you with one that we do typically in the classroom called sound spelling mapping. And I'm going to leave you with some takeaways around reading aloud because that's something that we do both in school and at home. All right. So let's start with reading acquisition. And I want you to think about this. Now, if you're a parent, this might not be easy for you to do, but if you're a teacher, if you're an educator, you can probably do this little activity with me. I want you to think about in a classroom of 24 students, just think about this, according to statistics, about how many of those 24 will learn to read in a seemingly effortless way, or they may come to school already knowing how to read. About how many in that class of 24 will learn to read relatively easily with broad instruction? Okay. How many of us, how many children, when we come to school, we require code-based, explicit, systematic, sequential instruction, which is commonly referred to as structured literacy? And how many would require that and additional time and instruction, right? So again, if you're a parent, this might not be something for you to really be able to wrap your head around since you're not working with a class of students. If you're an educator, just think about this, about how many kids fall into the category in a class of 24. And again, think about maybe not your specific classroom, but just think about reading as kind of a generally distributed skill. All right, I'm going to give you a minute just to ponder that for yourself about how many kids would fit into each of those categories. All righty. I know I didn't give you much time for that little activity, but let's just see what, statistically speaking, we know about that class of 24. So about 5% of us for about 5% of us, reading is seemingly effortless. So in a class of 24, that's about 1 to 2 kids. So let's just say 1 here. For around a third of us, around 35% of us, reading is seemingly effortless, is relatively easy with broad instruction. So that would be about 8. Okay, so about a third of us are going to be fine no matter what. However, about 11 in that classroom of 24 are going to require that code-based, explicit, systematic, sequential instruction, about 45% of us. And then 10 to 15% of us require that and much more. So again, think about this. About 40% of us, we're going to be okay. About 60% of us, we require a structured approach to really learn to read. Right? Now, perhaps this isn't what you see in your own classrooms, but that's okay. This is just kind of that general arc of distribution around reading as a learned skill. So ponder that for a minute and go ahead and jot in the chat, what conclusion can you draw? Just jot in the chat, what conclusion can you draw? Do not be shy. Someone has to break the chat barrier. Let's see what we got. Yeah, Kelly, says better to begin with structured literacy. More children need more support than we can often give. That's probably true, Claire. Yeah, it's hard. Why less than 40% of fourth graders read proficiently in the US? Yes. Over half the class needs structured literacy. Systematic instructions necessary every day. Awesome. Great. Yes, we need that structured approach. Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. Wonderful conclusions. And I want to go back to that one that somebody mentioned. Why don't we have more kids who are proficient in this country? According to the NAEP, only about a third of our kids are proficient at 4th and 8th grade, and about leaves about 2/3 who aren't. Well, interestingly enough, when you look back at this chart, it's kind of matches up that we're doing great with the kids that are going to learn to read relatively easily anyway. We're not doing well with those students who need a more explicit approach. So thank you. Now, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, because here's the great hope. The great hope is that we really can teach the vast majority of our kids to read, because decades of research from multiple fields demonstrate that 90 to 95% of students, regardless of background, can learn to read proficiently or better with the right instructional approach. And I always think about this. When we think about our tier 1 instruction, yes, we are going to have some students who are going to more easily pick up reading, more intuit the system. However, we want to cast the widest swath around the most students. We want to capture as many students we can, and a structured approach is more effective for most of our students, right? So why is that, though? Why is that? Why is it so important? Why is instruction so important? Well, I always go back to our friend Marianne Wolf, who's one of my favorite human beings. And she basically says, human beings were never born to read. And by the way, I love this book, Read or Come Home. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's about reading in the digital age, which is very interesting. We could have a whole other webinar on that. But when you think about the grand timeline of humanity, let's say it's, from here to here, speech has been with us for a very long time. We have the physiology and the impetus and the experience, but the written code has not been with us for very long, right? And it's not universal in all languages. It's actually quite rare. Only about 10% of the world's languages even has a written code. So it's been with us for a short amount of time. It's not a naturally occurring thing. We don't have those neural mechanisms in place to learn to read naturally. And those neural networks are primarily constructed through instruction, right? So instruction really counts. So that's just a little, tidbit on reading acquisition. Now let's turn to another big idea here about neuroscience. And of course, we could spend lots of time on this, and we don't have lots of time, so we're going to just do a little tidbit about this, about some neuroscientific findings. Now, before we do that, there's a couple of terms we need to make sure that we are familiar with, and the first term is phoneme. And the phoneme is the smallest unit of a speech sound. And for example, is a phoneme, A is a phoneme, right? Now that's the sound. When you see those little marks, that's the sound. So F is a phoneme, right? Now, a grapheme is a letter or group of letters that represent an individual speech sound. So F can be represented by PH, GH, LF, FF, or F, right? A can be represented by A consonant E, AI, AY, EY, EIGH, right? So for some of our speech sounds, for some of our phonemes, there's a lot of different graphemes that can represent those speech sounds, okay? So knowing that, let's take a look at a little diagram here. This is from Stanislaus Dehaene. I had the opportunity to hear him speak at Plain Talk last year. He's probably, if not the world's leading authority, probably one of the leading authorities on the neuroscience of language. And if you look at this image, it's showing the brain, synapses in the brain, left hemisphere of the brain, and showing that synaptic connections between graphemes and phonemes, right? So we look at those graphemes, those letters or letter combinations. We connect that to their sounds. And once we decode that word, we have access to meaning. But then I also want you to look at, there's a little green route there too that goes right from graphemes to meaning. What's going on there? So here's what Stanislaus Dehaene has to say about this. So when we're teaching kids to read, they're basically compiling statistics about letters and words, about how this thing called reading works. And what reading acquisition does is it specializes an area for this fast recognition of graphemes, and it establishes a functional link to those speech units or phonemes, right? So we're teaching kids how to unlock that code. Now, when they first start to read, they initially decipher that, going into that route in a very kind of painstaking way. And for some kids, it's difficult and has to be explicitly taught. But as reading automatizes, words take a more direct unconscious route, and we have a more instant access to meaning. So think about this with our early readers, right? We're unlocking that word. And then if we have that meaning of that word in our lexicon, in our neural dictionary, then we can know what that word means. We've unlocked the word, we know what it means, right? So what does this mean for us as teachers and parents? Well, it means that we want to teach kids that code. What is that code all about? And we want to develop language. We want to develop vocabulary so that when they do decode that word, there's access to meaning. Now, how do we move from this more painstaking yellow route to that quicker green route? Well, this is another key term that those of you who are educators, I'm sure, have heard this: orthographic mapping. I'll let you read this definition to yourself. So the orthographic mapping process explains how that reader develops a sight vocabulary, right? Readers form that letter sound knowledge through that phonic decoding to orthographic mapping for that instantaneous recognition. Now, it's not a visual process. It doesn't happen visually. Every step in that word reading development requires that phonologic integration. So this orthographic mapping really starts with this yellow route, and then through phonic decoding and practice and application, we develop that more instantaneous route. For some of our kids, they don't need many repetitions to be able to unlock a word or orthographically map a word. Some of our kids need lots of repetition, right? So, key term here, I also want us to think about in orthographic mapping, you see that phrase sight words. When we talk about sight words, we're just talking about those words that we automatically recognize as if by sight, right? And I think this comes from Jan Hasbrook. She said, I think this was her, she said, every word aspires to be a sight word, right? We want all of our words to be sight words, words that are instantly available, instantly retrieved. When you and I move across text, that process, that decoding process has gone underground because we have so many words in our mental dictionary that are orthographically mapped for seemingly instantaneous retrieval, right? So to bring this to a close with Stanislaus Dehaene, this is what he says, we as teachers need to focus on that grapheme phoneme route at the beginning. That direct route is going to develop spontaneously with lots of practice as those words become orthographically mapped for instant access. He also talks about the variables that predict success. Number one is teaching that phoneme graphing relationship, right? Number two, the size of a child's spoken vocabulary. Let's make sure we know that the science of reading is not just about phonics, right? It's also about what we know about developing language with our kids. And that practice is really important. We want to read books and frequent practice. Now, sometimes things don't go as planned, right? And sometimes we see something like this, and this is obviously a mock-up of brain scans that sometimes we see with our fluent readers that kind of network that you saw earlier, this is the left hemisphere. When they go through fMRI machine scans, we see these three areas of the brain activate in the process of reading. And sometimes with our struggling reader, we don't see that robust activation in that left hemisphere. And so we kind of ask, well, what's going on here? So sometimes what we see is very little activation with our struggling readers in that left hemisphere, which is where we want to build that neural system from its most efficient access. But sometimes with our struggling readers, we see more activation in the right hemisphere. This is an area that's not well suited to reading. This is what Sally Shaywitz calls reading on the wrong side of the brain. And unfortunately, that can sometimes be developed through instruction. If we teach kids to guess or memorize words or only use context clues, we may be inadvertently building reading in the right hemisphere, which is the hemisphere not well suited to reading. It's an area more suited to memorizing visual images, right? Now, this is I'm on a campaign for this because when I came up as a teacher, this is how I was taught to teach children to read. And so it's really important that we rethink some of those now misconceptions about instruction. So this would be a typical book I might see with a kindergarten beginning reader, right? I take pencils. I take markers. I take paper. I take scissors, right? And some kids might be given this book during their reading instruction time. But here's my question to you. If I'm a 5-year-old kindergartner, am I really reading? Am I unlocking those words? Do I know that, for example, in scissors, the SC pattern makes the sound, or do I know about R controlled? Do I know about vowel consonant E? No, I mean, I have typically not been taught those things early on. So what am I doing if I'm a little reader who's reading that book? I'm probably, you guessed it, I'm memorizing the pattern because the pattern is the same on every page. And then I'm looking at the picture to figure out how the pattern completes. And what we're doing here is we're having kids memorize the pattern, look at the picture, and guess the word. And these strategies are unfortunately building word forms in the right hemisphere. That's an area that's not well suited to reading. So when I think about some of the things that I was taught to do with my students, I was taught to have students, get a running start, have a go, take a guess, and then does it make sense? Look at the picture. Pictures are not word recognition strategies. They are meaning confirmation strategies, right? Then we might say to kids, well, listen, does that sound right? In context, does that sound right? But context does not have a good track record. Only about 10% of the time does context really work to figure out a word. Or we might say, well, does that word look like it could be that word? And that is encouraging kids to think of reading as a visual act. And of course, indeed, it is not, right? So, some of these things that we've typically done, that I did, have been building neural networks in the right hemisphere. We want our kids to look at the words, move left or right through the word, blend those letter sounds, develop that decoding habit, use pictures to confirm meaning, not to recognize words, right? Phonic decoding is that way to establish that orthographic mapping that is critical for us to have that cognitive energy to be able to devote our way to comprehension, right? Go ahead and read this to yourself from David Kilpatrick. So skilled readers do not have to rely heavily on context for reading words. That's what weak readers typically do, right? We don't want to teach kids the strategies and habits of our weaker readers. So skilled readers read, weaker readers guess. Right? So what are some higher impact strategies? Well, we want to put these tools in our children's toolkit. We want them to look at the word and sound out the word. Don't just get a running start, sound out the whole thing, right? Then ask yourself, does this sound right? Fix pronunciations as needed and use those pictures to confirm meaning, but not for word recognition. It's not a sustainable strategy, right? So when I think back about some of what were called cueing systems that I used as a teacher, that graphophonic knowledge really has to come first, and those other cues are really backup systems, right? Now, I think that's important to remember. Sometimes people say, "Oh, but Laura, is that important for everybody? Is it important for all kids?" And I want to go back to, again, Stanislaus Dehaene. He says it's not true there are hundreds of ways to learn to read. When it comes to reading, we all roughly have the same brain that imposes the same constraints and the same learning sequence. Now, go back to that activity I had you do at the beginning. Do some of us learn in more implicit ways without explicit phonics instruction? Yes, but remember, learning to read is not natural. There aren't a lot of us who learn that way. And we don't know who those children might be when they come to school. We don't know. So explicit instruction, casting that widest swath, is really good for most all of us, and it's imperative for most of us, right? Okay, I know that was a teeny little snapshot around the neuroscience, what we know about the reading brain. So let's move on to a couple of frameworks, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this only because I want to be cognizant of time, and I know that many of the educators turning in tonight probably know this. So let's talk about these and why they're called guiding frameworks. Well, the first guiding framework that I always return to when I think about laying a foundation for understanding the science of reading is what's called the simple view of reading, and it's really the big picture of reading. It's the equation for reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is a product of decoding or word recognition and language comprehension, or it's often been called listening comprehension or linguistic comprehension. Simply put, decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. Now, probably one of the most important things to remember about the simple view, it's a product, it's not a sum. It's not like kids come to school and we teach them to decode. Then we develop some language comprehension skills and they read, voila. It's this interplay and the integration of both of those. They're not additive domains, they're multiplicative domains that makes up reading comprehension. And we can actually use numbers to help us understand that. So let's use the number 1 as evidence of, and 0 as no evidence. So a child comes to school, they haven't learned to decode yet, but they have some language comprehension. They come to school with some background knowledge and some understanding of the syntax of language, et cetera, et cetera. So if I were to make this into an equation, it would be 0 for decoding and 1 for language comprehension, but 0 times 1, 0, right? So the two are codependent on one another. Same thing's true. We can teach kids to decode, but if we don't also develop that language comprehension, 1 times 0, Still 0, right? And of course, we know some kids where we might give them a 0.5 and a 0.5, but that would be 0.25, which is still not enough for robust reading comprehension. Now, I'm going to illustrate for you what it's like to be a novice reader so that you can understand the implications of both of these two domains in your cognitive load. So I'm going to give you something to read, and I want you to read it, but I also want you to reflect on what's going on cognitively for you, and what are you doing as a reader? How are you feeling as a reader when you read this paragraph? Okay, I'd like you to just jot in the chat what happened to you as a reader as you read through this paragraph? What happened to your cognition? What happened to your comprehension? What behaviors did you take on as you read through this paragraph? Go ahead and just write something in the chat. Let's see what we got. Lost, just lost, says Janet. Okay, anybody else have a thought on that? Lots of rereading to try to gain meaning. I started to zone out. I would need to reread. I got lost in the words, complicated vocabulary. Exactly. I paused constantly, rereading. Once I had brain overload, I decided not to keep going. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. So this, if you had, and I don't mean to imply that no one here tonight is an expert on transpersonal agroecology. Maybe you are. So that might be the truth. But if you're not, like me, yes, all those things probably happened to you as a reader because of two main things. Number one, you did not have in your lexicon those words, or some of those words, orthographically mapped for that instant access. And number two, you may not have the meaning of those words, right? So those are some underlying issues with fluency, right? You weren't able to read fluently, so you kept stopping and backing up, or you gave up because you lost the thread of meaning. When I think about reading is really a flow that allows us to carry a thread of meaning throughout the text. And if you can't read fluently, you can't develop that flow, right? So you had the vocabulary issues, the decoding issues, because those words weren't automatically retrievable. The idea here, of course, is that when we're liberated from the cognitive load of just getting that text off the page, and when we have a robust oral language, we have cognitive energy available to navigate our way through text and think our way through text, which is what comprehension really is, right? And you also demonstrated some coping strategies too, like rereading, pausing. Yeah, exactly. All right, very good. So that's one of the baseline models, of course, a simple view. The other baseline model is Scarborough's rope, and I'm guessing again, maybe some of you are quite familiar with this. I love this. It's a visual metaphor for what skilled reading is all about. It really shows these sub-skills. And what's nice about seeing them as individual strands is they can be taught and developed. They can be assessed. I like to think of the top half of the rope, language comprehension. Those are capacities or capabilities that we develop with kids. I don't really think of them quite like skills. We help students develop their background knowledge and their vocabulary and the understanding of the semantics and syntax of our language. We help them develop, inferential comprehension and understanding about things like print concepts and genre. Those are developed capabilities, right? Those become increasingly strategic over time, so that you and I, when we navigate our way through text, we're utilizing all those different strands to help us make sense of text. Word recognition is a little different. I consider these skills, the skill of phonology, or understanding, all the way down to that phoneme level, those sounds of language, decoding, bringing in the print to help us understand that alphabetic principle so that we can decode and encode. And then eventually, remember, we want all that to come together for that instant sight recognition. And those skills, as evidenced by the braid, become increasingly automatic, just like a braid gets tighter with fewer gaps to the point where you can't discern which of the three strands, is there. That increasing automaticity and that increasing strategic use of those language comprehension capabilities then can intertwine to represent skilled reading. And I just think it's a very elegant and beautiful model to help us really understand those sub-skills and those strands and capabilities that allow us to develop that flow, right? So those are the kind of key frameworks that really lay the foundation for understanding the process of reading and how instruction needs to overlay that. The simple view of reading a Scarborough's Rope are just that, they're frameworks. They don't really give us the how-to, right? So that's where the application of those frameworks is really where the science of reading leads us. We have this body of evidence, we have this body of research and guideposts and North Stars, right? And then we have to then figure out from that, what are practices that give us the best bang for our buck based on that evidence base. So before we adjourn tonight, I'm just going to give you a couple of possibilities here. And let's start with sound spelling mapping. So this is something that we do with our materials at 95% Group. And we believe in giving kids manipulative supports like chips. These are little phonics chips, we call them. And we love to use different colors and gestures because we think that approach is really helpful for our students. So just imagine that our students have learned that these different phonetic elements are represented by different colors of chips. So we teach kids about consonants, about digraphs, short vowels, long vowels, vowel teams, our controlled vowels, all those patterns, right? Those phonetic elements and those patterns of language. So sound spelling mapping has these different steps. And we call this a routine. And I'll talk a little bit about routines in a moment. So we teach children, say the word, finger stretch the sounds, count the sounds, draw around your boxes, and I'll show you some boxes in a moment, pull down your phonics chips one sound at a time, and then write the letters below each box and say the word. Okay, so say the word, finger stretch the sounds, count the sounds, draw around the boxes, pull one sound down at a time, write the letters below the box, and say the word, right? Now that's our routine. One thing I want to share with you about routines and the power of routines. We know that when we teach children routines, and they can count on that as a process, it allows them to devote more cognitive energy to the product or to the content. So we like to use replicable, scalable routines so that we free up some cognitive energy. The kids don't have to think about that routine because it's already routinized, and they can really focus on what they're learning. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say the word. So say the word wig. Let's finger stretch the sounds. W, I, G. And let's count the sounds. How many sounds? 3. So we're going to draw around 3 boxes. Now, one thing you'll notice that I did, which I think turned out right, as I'm facing you, when I finger stretch the sounds, I want to finger stretch the sounds so they show my students a left to right progression. That's what I was going for. All right, and then we're going to draw around the boxes. Then we're going to pull the sounds into the boxes. So the first sound is W. That's a consonant. So remember, blue is a consonant chip. I, that's a short vowel. Red is a short vowel chip. G, another consonant chip, right? Wig. So we pull the sounds to the boxes. W, I, G, wig. And then the next step is to write the letters below the box. So what letter do we use to spell W? Let's write the W. What letter do we use to spell I? Let's write the I. What letter do we use to spell G? Let's write the G. Okay, so that's basically our sound spelling routine. Now, we also use this with words that don't fit a particular pattern, words that we call unexpected or unexpected spellings. So let me just model that for you. Today, we're going to be spelling words that don't fit the patterns we've learned, and I still want to use my sound spelling mapping. Now, remember, each box is for one sound. The word is the. Say the word with me, the. Let's finger stretch the sounds. The, How many sounds? 2. How many boxes? 2. So this time I'm just going to put a little dot in the corner of those 2 boxes. Now, watch me write the letter or letters that represent each sound. What was the first sound? V. That's TH. Next sound, Now, when I say that sound, you might think you might hear that sound, but in this word, it is spelled with an E. And so I write the E in the second box. And sometimes we draw, this is another option, just draw a heart around the part of the word, above the part of the word that is the unexpected spelling. Excuse me. What is the word? The. Now, at this point, I don't really have to talk about the schwa sound. This is just a way for us to use mapping even when words are unexpectedly spelled. Now, this was a big aha or change for me in my own practice. I know as a teacher, I used to give kids lots and lots of flashcards for those unexpected spelling words, those irregular words. But the truth is, we want to map whatever part of it we know, and then highlight that unexpected part. So that will help kids really internalize that this word has both expected and unexpected spellings. Okay, so sound spelling mapping, if that's a new strategy for you, I encourage you to have a go and give it a try. If it's a strategy that you currently use, I hope this was affirming to you in your practice. All right, now reading aloud. This is something that is really so important to us as parents, so important to us as teachers that we read to and with our students. And this really connects to that top half of the rope. Oral language, our children's language is really the vital foundation for reading comprehension and its development. It's really important, right? Remember that simple view of reading, it's not just decoding, it's decoding and language as well. I want to play this little video for you. Maybe some of you have seen this. That really is just a great model of our importance of language development.
Okay. They need to work on that, right? Yes, okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh, no, not this one. This is the grand finale of this. Yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right. Don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. And then it was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? But don't do it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right.
Okay, I don't know about you, but I could not love that more. I could not love that more. And couldn't we spend so much time just kind of unpacking that and thinking about, the gestures and the intonation, and I just couldn't love that more. So that's really important, right? Parents and those of us in teaching, it's really important that we have conversations with our kids to develop their oral language. Now, one of the ways that we can utilize this in classrooms and at home is through dialogic reading. And this is really what we call an interactive reading process where we use prompts and questions. And our goal is to read alongside with our students, but then encourage them to really be the storyteller, right? I'm going to pause and let you just read these research supports for this dialogic reading. Go ahead and read this to yourself. Okay, and this is something this particular process I'm going to share with you, which is called peer, is something we typically do with our youngest students, but it could be extended on with our older students as well. So let me just take you through peer and just give you some food for thought around this. So P is when the adult prompts the child to say something about the book. So as we're reading along, we point to the moth and we say, "What is this?" And the child says, "Butterfly." Now, what are you doing when you're just simply prompting them with a "what is it" question? You're focusing their attention, you're engaging the child, you're supporting their comprehension of the reading, and you're building vocabulary. Okay? The E is the evaluation of that response. So this is where we might say, "It looks like a butterfly, doesn't it? It's really a moth." Now, what are we doing here? We're correcting a child's response, we're adding new information. The next E is expands. This is an example where we would say, "What do you see?" The child says, "A boat." And we expand that. "Yes, it's a red rowboat." What we're doing here is we're increasing kind of this overall language response, and we're helping to build that vocabulary. And finally, R is when we repeat the prompt to make sure the child has learned. So we say, "Yes, it's a red rowboat. Can you say red rowboat?" And the child says, "Red rowboat." So this provides a model of more complex language structure to encourage the child to use more language, right? I just, as an aside, one of the things that we used to do in a school in which I worked, and some of you may know this, it's a strategy just called "Give Me Five." And this is where everybody in the school does this, like at lunchtime, and every adult in the school does this with the students, encouraging the children to use more language. So let's just take a lunchtime example. If a child says, "More pizza," and we say, "Give me five," to think of 5 or more words to express yourself. So we would be encouraging them to say, "Please, can I have more pizza?" Right? So this whole idea of, helping our kids expand their language is really what this is all about. So just remember peer. Peer, by the way, yes, not the first time through a book. It's the second time you read the same book. This is really important, whether you're a parent or whether you're a teacher. The first time we read a book, we want kids to just enjoy the whole story. We don't want to interrupt the story. We want to kind of get the whole thing and just really relish that story. But the second time through is when we can do these things, about helping, pause, expand, etc. And the goal is to have the child become the storyteller. And sometimes, as you go through this with our kids, the kids will start with a prompt, and we continue on with the sequence. So, okay. So, just to kind of wrap up, I know our time is just about at an end. But we did explore these ideas today. We talked about how do we learn to read. We talked a little bit about the neuroscience featuring my fave, Stan DeHaan. Did some examination of some of our key frameworks, and then looked at 2 strategies that we can take away. So some big ideas and essential facts around the science of reading are that reading, unlike speaking, is not naturally occurring. And the brain architecture for skilled reading is really the same for all of us. So we really want to master these foundational skills of reading, not just decoding, but also that vocabulary development. And that most of our developing readers, it's critically, vitally important that we enact systemic explicit instruction. Okay. Systematic is the word I meant to say. All right. I'm going to give you 1 minute just to do a super quick reflection to yourself. You don't have to write anything in the chat, but just think about kind of those 6 things, and what is something you'd like to learn more about, or what was affirming to you, right? So I'm going to give you 1 minute just to reflect. Affirmations or new learning. Okay, I know you didn't give you much time to think about that, but perhaps there's something here that just intrigued you that you want to learn more about. So I want to leave you with some action steps. So if you're an educator tuning in tonight, here's some things to think about. Know the research and evaluate that evidence, right? Choose carefully, because I know that we just don't have unlimited time in our classroom. Like we don't, how many of you have that pesky 30 minutes at the end of the day you just don't know what to do with? None of us, right? So we have to choose well when we think about research-based practices that we want to follow. Give yourself permission to stop what's not working. This is often the hardest part. We have practices and beliefs that are hard to part with because they've worked for some of our kids, if not most of our kids, right? But we always have to think about, remember, science is evolving and dynamic. When I told you the story about myself as a teacher and some of the practices that I used to use, does it make sense? Does it look right? Does it sound right? I mean, we have to give ourselves permission to discontinue things that don't have the highest impact, right? So we have to have the courage to reconsider sometimes. If any of you tonight are leaders, district leaders, building leaders, teacher leaders, think about what are some supports that you can help provide. We want building-wide and district-wide focus on the cause of literacy. If we don't have 90 to 95% of our kids reading proficiently, this needs to be an all-out effort on everybody's part. We need high-quality professional development and good classroom materials that allow us to play out what we're learning around the science of reading. I would also encourage you, teachers, it's a relentless pursuit. Just keep moving forward. This is so worth pursuing, right? If you're a parent listening in tonight, I would encourage you to talk with your child a lot. Developing that oral language base could not be more important. That's what reading starts. It starts from language. Read to your child, read with your child, read alongside your child. Encourage journaling. Encourage them to journal about their thoughts and adventures and dreams, and model and talk about your love for reading and writing. And finally, engage with your child's teacher to support what's happening in the classroom. I did put www.readingrockets.org there for you parents if you're not familiar with that particular, and teachers too. That's actually just a great resource. There's a whole section just for parents that I would encourage you to check out. If you're new to the science of reading, my favorite resource is Emily Hanford, American Public Media documentaries. She has done Hard Words, What the Words Say, and At a Loss for Words in 18, 19, 21. I can't remember exactly. I might be wrong about that. But she has a new one coming out, Sold a Story. I think it's coming out this week or next. So check out Emily Hanford, American Public Media Reports. I think she's really elevated our understanding as educators and as parents and as stakeholders around the science of reading. Some other key resources, I mentioned Stanislaus Dehaene, Marianne Wolf, Reader Come Home. Reading League has a Science of Reading Defining Guide. I wrote a little white paper around the science of reading that I can share with my friends at Hill. Mark Seidenberg has written Language at the Speed of Sight, which I think is a wonderful book as well. I also want to give a big shout out for the Science of Reading short course here at Hill Center. If some of this is new to you, if the science of reading is new to you, this is a terrific way for you to go through a 10 to 15 hour course that includes all those things you see on the right, those kind of 6 modules. It's self-paced. It's a wonderful way for you to dig deeply in your own time, and really understand, take that next step in the science of reading, right? And maybe when I stop talking, maybe Beth will want to say a little bit more about that. So thank you for allowing me to be with you tonight. I do want to kind of close with some thoughts, and one thought goes back to that 90 to 95%. You know, one of my favorite heroes in our field is Louisa Moats. And go ahead and read what she says, her words of wisdom. "95% can be a reality. That's why our company is called 95% Group, because that's our mission. That's our purpose for producing high quality materials and professional development to support our shared mission toward that goal. This can be a reality, and our children deserve no less." So, all right, I want to leave you with Tracy Whedon. Some of you may have heard her before. She's a lovely human being. And here's what she has to say about the science of reading.
Humankind's most precious treasure is our children, and our future depends on them. We recognize literacy as a fundamental human right that empowers individuals in a society. We also know that grim life outcomes are connected to illiteracy. We are resolved to prevent the collateral damage that is incurred by our students, especially the most vulnerable among them, when adults have limited access to the convergent scientific evidence. Research has yielded proven assessment and instructional practices with which every teacher and leader should be equipped. We believe that providing educators with this knowledge is a moral imperative. We are committed to evidence-aligned reading instruction being scaled with a sense of urgency in a comprehensive and systematic way by multiple stakeholders. We know that our children can be taught to read properly the first time. In a knowledge economy, the currency of the 21st century will be built on the foundation of skilled reading. Students who can read well have a place at the table of opportunity, whether their aspirations lead them to preparation for college or the workforce. We believe in a future where a collective focus on applying the science of reading through teacher and leader preparation, classroom application, and community engagement will elevate and transform every community, every nation, through the power of literacy. Join us.
I just love her. I could listen to her all day. And actually, I'm going to be in conversation with her next Tuesday. We're doing a little live webinar, Tracy and I, and it's called the Texas Tipping Point. And it's kind of about what's going on in Texas, but it also is just in general, some of her wonderful words of wisdom around reading and becoming heroes for our students. She's just so lovely. So thank you again. I'm sorry I went a couple minutes late here. This is my contact information. Also, please be sure to check out 95% Group. I'm so proud to be part of 95%. We really are a mission-driven organization that is here to support all the efforts that you're making every day and to honor you as educators and as parents, and to share the mission of literacy for all. So thank you again. And I think we probably have time for some questions.
That's great, Laura. Thank you. I'm glad you're making time for a few questions. We did have a few come in.
Sure.
So a teacher wrote in, knows their students, but not totally comfortable with using a sound wall effectively at this point. Mm-hmm. Teaching third grade, but students maybe feel like it's more of a first grade level. A lot of school support is going to kindergarten, some in first, some in second. Mm-hmm. But, decodable texts are not available. Doesn't sound like structured literacy's really been adopted. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you do next? What am I looking for in a program? Should I reach out for training? What am I doing as an educator in that situation?
Yeah, that's such a great question. First of all, I think we all have to, do our best to advocate for all of our students. I mean, that's the first thing you do, and I'm sure you do. And I encourage you to continue to bring data to the decision makers at your school to show, the data around where your kids are and the gap between where they are and where they could be, because it's vitally important that we catch our students early on and close that gap. Joe Torgerson did some research around if we can identify students early on who may struggle learning to read, we can close that gap in 15 minutes a day over a short amount of time. By the time our kids get to third grade, sometimes the amount of time that's required to close that gap between where they are and where they need to be grade level is insurmountable. It's, hours a day.
Yeah.
And also, we know that there's, a pretty direct correlation between kids who struggle with reading and further life deficits like dropping out of school and not thriving in, as Tracy put it, a knowledge economy. So advocating with data, I think, is really important. The second thing is, I think you have to seek any and all supports. If you have to, get materials from a lower grade teacher, from your interventionist, to use in your classroom for those kids that you identified as having those gaps. I think you have to, collaborate with anybody and everybody in your school to close those gaps as quickly as possible. We want to make sure that we've also identified the deficits. I encourage you to not just use a universal screener with your third graders, but to also use a diagnostic so that you can identify not just who's your high, middle, and low kids. That's what a universal screener does. A universal screener just identifies who's at benchmark, who's below benchmark, or above benchmark. It doesn't tell you why. It just tells you who. So I encourage you to use a diagnostic so that you can identify the actual pinpointed area of gap or struggle so that you can then really target your instruction. If you have just kids who are in the red or below benchmark and you just kind of lump them all together, your intervention time is not efficiently spent. But if you know that you've got these 3 children that are working on CVC words, and you've got these 3 children that have mastered CVC words, but they have not mastered long vowel silent E. And you've got, if you can pinpoint that, your intervention or your small group with those kids becomes much more efficient because you can really target that. So that requires a good diagnostic. The other thing I would encourage you to look for is, as in your advocacy, with your decision makers in your building, advocate for instructional materials. You want a, let's say, phonics program, for example, that is very explicit, systematic, and goes from less complex to more complex phonetics. And you want a continuum so that when you diagnose kids at a certain somewhere along that continuum, you know what resources you can use to teach it. So advocate with data, use diagnostics, make your small group time efficient, and advocate for explicit systematic resources in those gap areas.
Yep. So if I were a teacher listening to you right now, 2 questions would come to mind, one of which somebody asked, what's a good diagnostic? And my second question would be, how do I know what that continuum looks like? I don't feel like I can rely on the written curriculum. So what is that continuum? Where's the source of that for me?
Yeah, for sure. So there is a really great document, and I am going to give it to you, Kathy, to send out tomorrow.
Right.
It's a document that I've been using a lot recently, and it's about assessment. And it explains what's the difference between universal diagnostic progress monitoring and outcome assessments. And then on the document itself, it does list some examples of good universals, diagnostics, etc. Right? There's a website that I'll also send to you that you can distribute that is really, takes all the intensive intervention resources, including diagnostic, and kind of, gives you the features of them.
Mhm.
I've got to give a shout out for us at 95. We have a really good phonics screening instrument that is designed for you to sit down one-on-one with your student and in a very short amount of time, figure out exactly where on that continuum the student falls. And we offer a continuum which goes again from least complex to more complex in terms of phonetic elements. So I would look at our resources as well. I just have to give a shout out, and I feel very confident doing that. In terms of the actual sequence of phonetic elements, there is no one best sequence, but there are certain characteristics that make sequences of how you teach phonics better than others, right?
Yeah.
And of course, it has to go from simple to more complex. We don't want to get easily confused sounds taught right next to each other. I mean, there's certain characteristics that just make a sequence sensible. What's not sensible is to have a program where those skills are taught sporadically or haphazardly.
Mhm.
We have to make sure there's enough intensity of instruction. So when children are learning, for example, the short A, that they have lots of opportunities to learn about it and practice with it and blend it with other sounds that they currently know, so that there's an intensity of instruction. It's not just, gosh, here we're reading a book today, and oh, there's a short A, and oh, there's a vowel consonant E. Oh, there's
Right.
that
Right.
haphazard approach does not work. We have to go from the skill sequence to the application, not from reading to just a haphazard way of teaching phonics.
Yeah. I appreciate you
Does
pointing
that
that out.
answer, Kathy?
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. If decoding is a strength for a student and comprehension is challenging,
Yeah.
then is that the point of the continuum that we jump in? What are we looking at there when a child can sort of what we call just calling words,
Yeah,
but they're not making meaning as they're reading? Is
for
that when we
sure.
rely on those other strategies you talked about?
Yeah, so I would encourage a couple things. First, yes, let's make sure our students are really reading, right? I mean, sometimes our kids they compensate and they kind of look like readers and sound like readers, but they're more compensating their way through text
Mhm.
as opposed to really deeply having that orthographic mapping for automatic retrieval, right? So that's number one, just make sure that's really solid. Now let's assume that our students are really decoding well and the word recognition piece is really strong. Then let's make sure that those language comprehension strands are well developed, that we have the background knowledge and the content knowledge and the vocabulary, because those things are critical to comprehension. You can't just decode a word. You also have to know what that word means. And that's part of building that mental dictionary. The third thing I would encourage is if our students have relatively good language and word recognition skills, sometimes our kids need a more explicit instruction in strategies, in like really helping us as readers to do things like, how do I find that main idea? How do I get the gist of what I'm reading? How do I summarize my reading? How do I infer in a text? How do I use my knowledge plus the author's knowledge to infer in a text? So comprehension strategy instruction can be useful, especially for our kids who maybe don't have other indicators that are getting in the way of their comprehension.
Yeah.
So word recognition, fluency, background knowledge, vocabulary, build all those things. And if those are all in place, then let's really look at how do we be more explicit with strategy instruction.
Excellent. Thank you for that. What is a good resource for learning more about oral discourse? And this came, of course, after you showed that video that we all love so much. But how, really integrating those opportunities during the day with students, is there a resource I could go if I wanted to know more about that?
Oh, that's a really good one. Oral discourse, that's a really good one. I'm going to ask, if there's anybody in the group here today that has a really good resource for that, pop it in the chat, or Kathy, Beth, anybody else that has a good resource for oral discourse. I mean, I have kind of my go-tos around vocabulary, but
Just
Anybody
think,
have an idea on that?
like, well, kind of the give me five type strategy that you
Yeah.
offered, I think was one that, if there are more of those that, somebody could really go look into. So we will dig.
Yeah, and let me put some thought
And,
behind it, because nothing's
yeah.
coming like right off the top of my head, and I
Right,
probably have
right.
something here that I just am not thinking of. So let me put some more thought behind it. But again, any of you that are here tonight, if something comes to your mind, just pop it in the chat for us, and we'll all go, oh yes, perfect.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Last question for you. Is there an age where children should read by themselves? So if I'm a parent with a 9-year-old that doesn't prefer to read on their own and only, reads if I'm reading with them, what's that? Where should I sort of draw the line and say something's up, or,
Yeah.
how do I judge that?
Yeah. So that's a complicated thing to ask, because I guess my question back would be, can the child read on their own, but they just don't want to because they want to have that wonderful, cozy cluster with mom and dad when they're reading together? Those are two different things. If it's the latter, and as a parent you just want to encourage your child to do some more reading on their own, I think you can think about, in the classroom, what we typically do is, one of our mottos is I do, we do, you do. And sometimes even in home reading, we could even draw a card every night. It's an I do card, a we do card, or a you do card. And so that means that some nights I'm going to read to you, some nights we're going to read together and take turns, some nights you're going to read to me. That's one way to encourage it. But another thing too is we could also just say to our boys and girls, I want you to read a little bit to me tonight, and afterwards we're going to read together, and just make it not a punitive thing.
Right.
Now, so that's one thing, I think. But the other question is, if the child is not yet reading independently, if the question is, when do we want that to really happen? I would say that there is a reason that we have a lot of read by 3 initiatives, because we know that typically once we get to 3rd grade, the complexity demands of reading really ramp up. When we look at 3rd grade curricula, when we think about the math and the social studies and the science, the content areas, in addition to the reading, things really ramp up, and our kids are expected to kind of read at that level in order to comprehend concepts. So that independence, we really want to get these foundational skills solid and get our kids on track in these K-2 years, so they can be those, joyful readers in a literate society by grade 2, by the end of grade 2.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the parent that asked the question actually has sort of rung in and said it's, can read very well, but, comprehension inference can be an issue. So I go back to your earlier response about how do you handle that,
Yeah.
Like, that looks like all of the questions. I do want to add in, we're going to include a reading brain video that we developed here at Hill, and we'll include that in the follow-up email along with the handout from Laura.
And I'll send that assessment document
Perfect.
that I mentioned.
So we'll and a video recording of this evening if you wanted to look at that again. And all of that will come out along with a survey that we really do hope that you will take just a couple of minutes to complete that for us, because it really guides the programming we offer through our community ed series each year. So your feedback is really important and truly does guide what we choose for topics and who we reach out to present. So you can have impact on that by responding to the survey. We really appreciate that. But I hope you find all of the resources helpful. I know you found tonight helpful. You've said so in the chat, and I always love to listen and hear what Laura has to say. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Laura, so much for a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I really hope that we will be able to see everyone back at Hill at some point. Thanks so much.